I'm a god.
Well, what if there is no tomorrow?
I'm a god.
There wasn't one today.
Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of It's Time to Rewind, a podcast stuck in its own time loop, right along with the movies we discuss. In this season, we're taking a look at Groundhog Day after day after day after day after day. I'm your host, Bubba Wheat from Flights, Tights, and Movie Nights, and in this episode, we're discussing Phil's 5th February 2nd, Groundhog Day, that starts at 38 minutes and 46 seconds, with Phil waking up, although the movie skips over Sonny and Cher and goes straight to the Pennsylvania Polka as Phil meets Nancy at Gobbler's Knob, and ends at 41 minutes even, with Phil repeatedly calling Nancy by the name Rita during a makeout session and proposes to smooth things over. Today, my guest once again is Jess from French Toast Sunday. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me back again.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. It feels like we just did this episode not that long ago.
Yeah, it went by quickly.
Yes, it certainly did. And we already talked about, time loop movies in general, so let's go ahead and just get right into today's loop. I mentioned that Phil's previous day was the first day that the film skipped some of the milestones that we've seen repeated. And this is the first day where he goes completely off script, and we don't really see a single bit of repetition in this entire day.
Yeah, I think seeing it that many times, I'm not sure that it would add too much to seeing it all over again, unless he was going to actually have very different responses to things, which I imagine at this point he probably doesn't, or he just bypasses it altogether.
I mean, we do see, he goes to Gobbler's Knob to meet Nancy, and he plays this memory manipulation. I think it's interesting that what he does is actually similar to something that really does work on people. The one that I read about, what you do is you get somebody to remember an event in their life that actually happened. You usually prompt them to remember very specific details of something important to them, like their wedding or their prom or something along those lines. And then after you do that, you ask them to remember, quote unquote, something that didn't actually happen. And I think it's because they're already accessing their memory. The brain will basically fill in the blanks, and they will believe what you are telling them is a memory rather than just a lie.
That makes a lot of sense, because our memories are so fallible and easily manipulated. If I told myself right now, remember the time that you ate, steak and tacos and mashed potatoes for dinner on, Groundhog Day when you were 13 years old, I can literally make up that memory in my mind. And it's very, very easy to implant yourself with, false memories. And especially if someone else was to bring something up, it wouldn't be that difficult to fill in the blanks, because thinking back to your high school class, your high school English class, it would be so hazy to remember those details that it would be so very simple to plug in someone into that memory.
Yeah, and even though that's regardless of the fact that the age difference between the actress that plays Nancy and Bill Murray as an actor at this time is there's at least 12 years difference between the two of them.
I didn't look it up, but I was curious, because I'm I don't buy that they're the same age, but they didn't necessarily seem like an extreme age difference either. So, but I wasn't sure, but yeah, she definitely looks quite a bit younger than him.
Yeah, I believe that, I didn't double check it, but I did hear another podcast, the Groundhog Minutes. That's basically my big chunk of research, is just listening to other people who did their research already.
Yeah.
And I believe that the actress that played Nancy is in her mid to late 20s, and then Bill Murray is 41 or 42.
Yeah, I think that kind of plays into another thing that I thought about with this interaction where he so like easily gets her to like get on board with his uh, fiction is that people just are inclined to be polite and they don't want to be rude. They want to be, you know, people pleasing and they don't want to say, no, that didn't happen. Like
Yeah.
that would be very awkward to like turn down his recollection.
Well, and
And you don't,
especially women, because and this
yeah,
also goes into the problematic territory, something that's a lot more aware, where hopefully people are a lot more aware of it now than they were in the 90s. Just the fact that as a 20-something-year-old woman out in public, she wouldn't want to make a scene or, do something to agitate a 40-year-old man that's, that taller and bigger than her.
yeah, and it's not like he's not charming. Like he comes off fairly charming and like without being aggressive, he is quite insistent.
Hmm.
So it would be pretty easy to be like, just go along with it because to flat out like refuse to go along with it would feel like you're being rude and feel like just not question that there's a possibility that you could be forgetting this person.
Hmm. And speaking of problematic, do you think this day is Phil at his like absolute worst?
It's really bad. it is it is very bad. Like if you really wanted to be harsh about it, like you might say that this is like negates him at like his whole development as a character. I mean, I'm definitely not willing to go that far in like the realm of like the screenplay and just it makes sense that someone would write this into a movie.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's very bad. It's very deceptive, and at the end of the day, this never existed to her.
Right.
So it really we kind of touched on it in the last episode. If the other person doesn't actually experience it, is it still something that you feel comfortable doing yourself because you're still experiencing it?
Yeah, because like you said, there's no consequence. There's zero harmful effects towards the character of Nancy. Like Nancy is not going to face any negative repercussions from Phil's actions. But how does that work with the intent of his actions?
Mm-hmm. It's definitely an interesting ethical dilemma, and the movie doesn't necessarily give it space to like debate that in the movie. But for the sake of devoting a podcast episode to this chunk of time in the movie, I think it's definitely worth bringing up and questioning.
Yeah, I think it is really a difficult question, and I'm not sure if I really have an answer either. Like, obviously not ethically, but even personally, whether or not I think. I take that back a little bit. I clearly think that this is not something right for Phil to do.
Right.
But whether or not it's something that he would have to atone for in one way or another in like future, like once Phil improves himself as a person, if this is something that he should really have to reflect on as something that he did do that was wrong.
Yeah, I think it could have been impactful to kind of confront the way that he treated her later on in the movie. Um, but it kind of just breezes by it quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it is, somewhat humorous in the context of the scene, like if you don't think too deeply into it. Like it's, he's being a scoundrel. Like that's the point of this section of the movie is that he's being a bit depraved because he knows that there's, no consequences. So
Yeah, at this
yeah,
point we're right there with Phil. Like, this is him having fun, blowing off steam, going on dates with no consequences because everything's going to reset the next morning. And from his perspective, what's the harm? What's the harm?
Yeah, but it's also in the scene where they are hooking up. He, like, the fact that he's like calling her Rita during this experience
Mm-hmm.
is I mean,
it's really bad.
Yeah.
and
Talk
I
about
feel
like fantasy fulfillment.
Yeah, and I feel like we touched upon this a little bit in the last episode, but I would say, other than like that little connection with the poetry, which, from his perspective, that wasn't even really a connection. That was just, her calling him self-centered and him blowing it off. And he has made several like sexual jokes towards Rita. The very first day, the February 1st, whenever he talks about if she asks him if there's anything else that she can help him with, and like he mentions his pelvic tilt, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, he hasn't really made any real implication that he's actually interested in Rita.
Yeah, it's kind of the first, like, besides those flirtations, which seem like he would do that to any, semi-attractive woman in his sphere. Not saying that Rita is semi-attractive, but of course she is, so he's, just gonna have these playful, do these playful lines on her. But besides that, he really doesn't, until this scene, it kind of hints more at, someone he might have like more of an interest in her than you previously thought.
Yeah, this is not just telling the audience, but in a way telling Phil that, maybe there's something else going on between him and Rita that he didn't know about until now. And I would also say, we talked about Phil manipulating Nancy's memory with the reminiscent of high school, but this is also very reminiscent of Ned Ryerson's introduction, because that's very similar to what Ned does whenever he first comes up to Phil. He's like, you remember me? We went to high school together. This is almost like Phil in a way becoming Ned.
I didn't think about that, but yeah. It's not the best example for him to follow.
Right, especially since, he just punched Ned in the face. And so now he's becoming somebody that should be punched in the face. But I also think it's interesting that, whenever Ned did this, it didn't actually work on Phil, because he was going through all these very specific details, but they were details that were specific to Ned's memory and not Phil's memory.
Right. It wasn't like tapping into something there.
Yeah, so Phil already had a baseline with something that he knew that Nancy would remember. And so that's why it worked for Phil, but it didn't work for Ned.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that overlap there.
It's been interesting just seeing these connections whenever you really look at a movie like this a lot more deeply. This is, I think, one of the shortest loops that I've covered on here so far. And that's really all I have because this was just like a little over 2 minutes. So I don't really have anything else. Did you have anything else that you wanted to mention about this iteration of the loop?
Well, the scene ends like their dialogue basically ends with her being aggravated about him saying Rita, and then he basically just says that he loves her and then goes so far as to propose to her, and which is, a funny thing to say because it's so preposterous, but she seems into it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay.
Like from her
She-
perspective, it's a guy that she doesn't remember from that she knew in high school. That's now a weatherman in Philadelphia or in Pittsburgh, and he keeps calling her by the wrong name, but then wants to marry her, and that's
Yeah.
all okay.
Yeah, it kind of gives her like somewhat of a, I guess maybe like a shallow portrayal of her, like in that she's potentially quite shallow and is just like so flattered that he would go that far that she's into it.
Yeah, and also like a touch of desperation in there potentially.
Yeah, he definitely charmed her. I did like the actress that plays Nancy is Marie. I had to look this up because I was not familiar with her, but her name's Marita Garrity, and I thought she was great in the part. Like she was very well cast in that. She was kind of like fairly doe-eyed and like approachable person, and you know definitely someone you could see that he would like see and think was attractive. But she had some good timing, especially in the scene where he's convincing her that they went to high school together.
Yeah, just that look of what the audience knows is fake recognition, that where she just like lights up and then decides to go along with it.
Yeah, you can see kind of the wheels turning in her mind where she's like, I don't think so. And then even when he says, you know, that he is a reporter, weatherman in Pittsburgh, and she's like, oh, I should have known that. It's like, no, you shouldn't have known that.
Yeah, and you do get the impression that she has convinced herself by the end of just that 15 to 20 seconds that she did actually go to high school with him and didn't remember him until now.
Yeah, she gets fully there in that scene.
All right, well, that's all I got for this day. So why don't you go ahead and remind everybody where they can find you online?
So I am a contributor at FrenchToastSunday.com, and we have a long-running podcast. We've been on hiatus for a bit, but we definitely have a ton of episodes and plenty of content to listen to if you haven't heard us before. I also have a podcast that I did with the founder of French Toast Sunday, Lindsay. We had our own little show called Sorry in Advance, where we, both of us for the first time, watched all of the Star Wars movies and did an episode on each one. And I think it's a fun listen. We're not, you know, the point is not to like disparage the movies the whole way through. I think we do a healthy dose of, you know, opinions from both sides. But it was a really fun podcast to record, and check it out.
All right, and I am Bubba Wheat from Flights, Tights, and MovieNights.com, where you can find my writings on over 500 superhero and comic book movies, as well as this podcast. And you can also find this podcast, It's Time to Rewind, on Anchor.fm, as well as anywhere else where you can find podcasts. And that's it for another loop. Just remember to be kind, because it's time to rewind.
I'm a god. Well, what if there is no tomorrow? I'm a god. There wasn't one today.
Bill Connors?
I was short and I've sprouted.